Everybody, welcome to the Crit House. I'm Jeff Larson, and we are finishing up this week with our last edition of our Photo Educators Critique Group. It has been just a tremendous process to talk to these great photographers and educators over these last several weeks. As reintroductions, we have Dan Milnor, who showed us his work last week. Dan is with us here on the Crit House, as he has been before when he looked at some books, when he is a creative evangelist for Blur Books. Alex Kilbee is across the pond, and he's doing this so late at night, and he's such a champ. We greatly appreciate it. Alex Kilbee has a great photographic channel. If you have not seen it, it is The Photographic Eye, one of the better, if not the best, photographic channel on YouTube in my mind, except for Dan's. Sorry about that. Erin Carey has joined us. She is a photographer, an artist, and an educator. She is somebody who has taught me in person in a landscape class, and she is one of the better people I know to talk about photography, not only hers but others as well. And the person we're going to talk to today about her artwork is Suzanne Révy, and she, as well as everybody else here, is a photographer, except me, is a photographer and an educator. She's a writer, and Suzanne, I have to say, it's really an honor to have you here. I'm looking forward to seeing your work.
So this is a project I've been working on this for a couple of years now. I think it started to come together in early or mid 2019. Something like that. I had spent a long time photographing my kids. I have this big documentary project on them. And then I did get my MFA, and I was kind of burned out after I finished that, and was taking pictures with my iPhone. And we've talked a little bit about the need to sort of back off and do something in an easier way. And I did that and created this small body of work with the iPhone. And when I organized it into a show, I was beginning to think about, how is it that you make a single image from multiple pictures? Like, can you make a single piece of art from multiple pictures? And I think it was a little bit like looking at Instagram, these things were sort of kind of cogitating in my mind. And then I started to experiment. I started to do some landscape as my kids were getting, that project was winding down because they were both, heading to college, right? So that was the end of that. And I was beginning to look at the landscape, and I was playing around with putting pictures together. And then I started to do it more deliberately in this way, with these, setting up the camera and really just taking the 3 to 5, and in one case, 7 pictures as triptychs or as polyptychs. And then I was actually thinking about I grew up in California. I was thinking about going out there to photograph some childhood landscapes, but the pandemic happened. So I wasn't going to do that. And I live in this very Thoreauvian landscape here in Concord, Massachusetts. And so I just thought, well, I can't go anywhere and we can't see anybody. So I would just go out early in the morning and look for places that were I was not near people, and photograph early in the morning. And it has sort of snowballed from there. And I've just kind of kept at it. I'm going to just stop on this picture real fast. This was one of the, this was one of the first ones that I felt worked. And I was still doing them handheld at first, I eventually just decided I needed a tripod, and I changed cameras. So the first ones were with the Mamiya 7, which is what this is. And I sort of realized as I was working on the picture, there's this tree in the right side panel that I felt like, oh, that's kind of like me. And my younger son, who can be dramatic, shall we say, is like the tree in the center panel. And I have an older son who's more stoic and kind of in the left-hand panel. And then my husband all the way to the left. So it's a personal interpretation of this picture, symbolic. It feels like a family portrait to me. And as I was working on it, I sort of realized, the landscape opens up a lot of metaphor, a lot of symbolism, a lot of possibility for expression. So, and these go through the sequence. There is a sequence, and it seems to naturally want to flow through the seasons. It's a little bit different, I think, than what Erin was doing, because I think the seasons are maybe a little bit more obvious in the pictures. But I just find when I do sequence this work, I sort of start with spring and end with kind of early spring, and they just seem to naturally flow that way. what I'm interested in at this point is sort of what in the landscape, what is in the landscape, what was there, is it still there, is it still present, can you still feel the history of the place?
Suzanne, thanks. This is, so are you choosing amongst these images to be in that show? It's the Danforth, right?
The gallery space is fairly small, so it will certainly not be all of these. I gave you a pretty broad edit of this work.
Yeah.
So I expect that, you know, I'll have far fewer pictures. And I will probably have one of them printed or a couple of them printed on fabric of some kind. I'm collaborating with an audio artist to bring in some sound. I'm hoping to make the gallery feel like a sanctuary.
Fantastic. Erin, I'm assuming that you have some really good insight into your thoughts about this work.
Thank you for sharing this with us, Suzanne. And I think I've had the pleasure of seeing and being able to see this work for several years. So it's cool to be able to come in now a little bit later and see like where it's been going. So I think the thing I'm most struck by is really that the places seem intimate to you. So even though it has this thorough kind of like transcendental quality, there's like a quiet Zen experience, so that you're not just describing the history of the place, but you're bringing us into this place and you're letting us stop and stand still there. So I'm curious, or not curious in that you should answer to, but so I like how I respond to it. It's sort of like you let me take a breath, right? And so when you asked like book versus exhibition, you know, I would love to see these huge, right, and like envelop people. One of the first like photo shows, just anecdotally, that like I was really overwhelmed by as a super young artist in undergrad was Gursky, you know, looking at the sort of like the new images of Germany. Those were huge, you know, 8 by 12 feet in those galleries in the Met, and like they were darkly lit and you were alone with them in that space. And I feel like you kind of bring us to that moment of like, you're alone in this place and you're sharing a bit of yourself, but also you envelop us. And that's the part I find really thrilling and calming. So it has this kind of like Zen thing for me. I definitely think about, like, I'm looking at human gesture. I for sure see that like the trees can stand in for the metaphor, right, between all these allegories that are religious, but then also I think human, like, right, there's the absent presence of the structure that is human-like. So I feel like I got that. You didn't have to tell me the story about your family. I still sort of like, I looked at 4 characters in a space is kind of how I looked at that landscape. I find the use of 3 images in terms of the triptychs to be powerful and kind of like related to the like religious trifolds, right? In the way that we're used to seeing religious painting like unfold from the center out in the private naves or chapels. And so in that way, I find the 3 to be probably the most, like 3 frames to be the most powerful, for sure. I think the quality of light is something I'm also really struck by in general, that you're choosing like these really like dusty times of day, sort of the very beginnings and the very ends. I think I find that really like there's something really calming about the experience.
My favorite time of the day.
It is. It's the best, especially for color photographers, especially if you're working in color film, right? That restricted 3-stop range. This is like one of the like top images for me in terms of your grouping. Yeah, watching the mist sort of float down the water and disappear. I noticed actually in sort of looking at the work this time, as opposed to a year or 2 years ago, that I'm like really struck by the use of white space here, where I'm not sure I ever quite noticed the break in the frames before, quite to the level that I noticed at this go around. And I wonder if it's because your more recent images, you're using 5 and 6 and 7 panels. And so as they get smaller, the white bars became a little bit more prominent for me.
Do you mean smaller on the 3 panel ones, or
no? So like as you're doing like 5 or 7, like as there are more and more images, like I'm suddenly becoming more aware of the white, like the space in between. So like asking the question, like the overlap or like something that's been omitted, just as a visual thing, it's more prominent here. Whereas somehow it disappears more when there are only 3.
Right.
I don't know.
You know, that's one of those things also in person, the prints can all be the same size.
Of course. Yeah.
You know
so
what I mean? So that it changes a little bit.
You can shift that.
Yeah, you know, and
I guess I'm
and the one thing that
sorry. No, I guess I was just going to ask you, I'm curious to know for you, like, what is your goal for the viewer? So like when you put this together, like, are you describing the history? Is it somehow like narrative, or is it the experiential for you?
I think it's more experiential.
Okay.
I think it's more experiential. I mean, I think there's an element of history that is sort of present in the landscape if you allow yourself to kind of feel it, but it's not obvious, you know. I think that's why a lot of people are having a hard time sort of addressing climate change in landscape photography, because the changes are so subtle and so slow, you know.
Love this one too.
That can be a challenge, right? But the one thing that the whole Zen thing, you know, and sort of slowing down and looking, and to coin a Thoreauism, looking deliberately, right? Being deliberate. I do think when I do have overlaps where you see a detail twice, I think it encourages you to, I think we automatically try and work it out. Like, I think our brains are sort of hardwired to work it out. So, you know, if I see an element twice, like I see two little flowers here, you know, and I'll look again and again, and oh, yeah, that's there. And then, and I do think it sort of encourages you to maybe look at the details and then maybe step back and look at the whole, you know. And I think I'm hoping that I'm inviting viewers just to encourage them to slow down and look more deliberately.
Alex Kilbee, how's it?
How's it? I'm still awake. Suzanne, a lovely selection of images here. I'm particularly taken by the fact that they aren't just simply that you've stood in one place, then turned to the left, and turned to the right, and did one straight, and then to the left. That you've, as you said at the beginning, kind of thought about making a number of images from the same scene.
Mm-hmm.
And I find the ones that resonate with me the most, where there's a detail in one of the frames, because often, especially with this one that's on screen here, I'm looking at it, and you can sort of look at it and sort of almost discount the white bars and see it as a whole. But the ones where you have panels where there is a very definitive, you know, very shallow focus on, say, something that's quite close to you,
Right,
that it's great because it brings another layer, not just sort of visually, to the whole experience of seeing it, because you look at it, go, this is the whole scene, and then you realize that this is a very shallow depth of field image. This one's fairly got a lot more sort of depth, like you know. And what I like about that process is it kind of mimics the way that we often physically look at the environments like this.
right.
That we sit, I certainly look at the whole and I go, oh, I really, like this. And then you look at something that's a bit closer. And so it really puts me in a place where I would like to just walk around here. I would love to just see these places, and you said, I think Erin was saying about being enveloped by the images. I think you're right. If these were large installation pieces, they would just have such a huge amount of impact. Now, Erin mentioned something. You said that you've watched this project develop over years. And Suzanne, at the beginning when you were talking, this is an example of what I was talking about. I love this. Mm-hmm. That you said there was an image with the trees that represented, so your family, that you felt that was the first one that worked. And I think for people who are watching this, who are embarking on a project, or maybe feeling that their project is not panning out the way they thought it would be, did you ever have any moments where you kind of go, this is not working, and then it was that moment where it finally worked?
Yes. I mean, this one worked, and then it was months before another one did. You know, and I was learning a little bit about what I needed to do. Like, I realized all three panels have to work on their own, you know, like, or the three wouldn't come together. And I also realized that I really was going to have to use a tripod, and I took to using the RZ. So I had a small ground glass. I mean, these are medium format. I'm not huge. I'm just not a huge large format photographer. I like medium format. And so, but I still have a ground glass with the RZ. And so, because one thing I also discovered is I do need something riding across all three horizontally to pull them together. And it was just easier for me to sort of organize that. I don't always want it to be precisely lined up, but it was just finding with handheld, they weren't working or lining up. So it took me several months to figure out, okay, you're going to have to, and I had come from years ago, did street photography, the stuff I did with my kids. I was one of those photo editors in a magazine. I used to hire people like Dan back in the day. I had been really a handheld 35mm kind of photographer with my own work. So it was a little hard to force me, but I just thought, okay, I have to get myself on a tripod. I have to do it if I'm going to really explore this landscape. So it just took me some doing to figure out how to make these work,
Well, they have.
Thank you.
I certainly love them. Can I have some prints of the house? Because I've got lots of walls.
Dan Milnor, coming from a photojournalist background and a documentarian, and like, what's your input here for Suzanne? And I think you might be on mute, my friend. And you know what? You have to do that once, and every time we have a Zoom.
Oh yeah. There was chaos in the background here, so I had to mute. At one point in my life, I was photographing, doing portraits full time. And my friend Paul Giroux called me and said, "Oh, you probably think you're really good, but have you seen this woman named Suzanne Révy?" And I looked at her work and I was like, "Oh crap, she's so much better." So I knew Suzanne as a portrait photographer. I'm not a landscape person typically. I wouldn't reach out. I wouldn't go out of my way to look at landscape photography, but I love this work for a variety of reasons. Number one, also, Suzanne, before I forget, you could do something really cool with an accordion style book with this work. Small numbers, signed and numbered, maybe sell those for insane amounts of money to then whatever, do something, go to Vegas or buy a Corvette or something. When I looked through this work, the first picture, and I kid you not, it's in my notes, which you can't see, I froze on image number 16. That's the one that got me initially. But to Erin's point, I think the most successful of these are the triptychs, with a few exceptions. There are a couple 4 or 5, 6 panel images that I really like in the end, but overall, I think the triptychs work really well. Yeah. But the interesting thing, you used a word a minute ago that I think is absolutely perfect for this series, which is a sense of things being deliberate. The fracturing of these frames with the white lines into basically triptychs, or 4 frames or 5 frames. It's actually interesting because that's now beginning to play with how the human brain and the sense of memory works or doesn't work. So when you fracture into 3, it forces me to consider, I love this picture, by the way. This is one of the ones I love. When you fracture into multiples, it forces me to confront each as an individual. And then as I depart and walk away, the human brain starts to have to put the tapestry back together. Right. And that's not what the brain's designed to do. It's not designed to rebuild something perfectly. It rebuilds what's most appropriate to our own psyche, to us as an individual. The other place that I would love to see the potential of where this lives, and I had a student in Albania that's was from the UK, and he's working with an organization that places artwork in hospitals. And when I look at work like this, and I think of like the healing properties of this work, how amazing would it be to walk into a hospital and see these massively printed in those spaces? So I love this work. There's a million things you could do with this, a million places you can go. But I think fracturing these pictures into multiples is absolutely essential. I think if this was a single image, it wouldn't have the same resonance. And there's a few that we don't really have a whole lot of time, but there's a few that I would potentially call out. But again, the triptychs to me are the real sweet spot.
This is a broad edit. And, I realized what I really like are odd numbers. So 3, 5, and then I do have that one crazy 7 panel picture, which was actually kind of a surprise, but, and I obsessed over the width of those lines months. So go ahead, Jeff. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to ask, we haven't talked about, there are two images that have a human presence, an actual human presence.
Yes.
And what is your like thought about that? Because those are different than the ones that don't have it.
Well, I do have a few that have the human presence. Obviously, this one here, and there was one where you can see that's one of my kids actually in the tree, like you just see his arms. You know, I go back and forth on this. I kind of feel like I can get away with doing one or two in a broad selection of this. I think when there are a few others that have people in them. I have one that has our dog in it. And I feel like it changes the conversation. And at the end of the day, I just felt like they're stronger without the actual human presence in them, you know? So, but I was sort of interested in hearing what people thought about that, you know, with the presence of the person. I just had a show of this work down in Rhode Island, and somebody who saw it wrote to me and said they really liked that there was one. I had that one with, this one was in the show. Nothing else had a person in it, you know, from the selection that they had. And they thought it was pretty effective to just have that one figure. But so I would probably be very judicious in when I do a selection for either a show or a book with the person.
I love it, Suzanne.
Yeah, really
What's
good stuff.
that?
I know.
Thank you.
So I saw.
You know, this
Oh,
was a surprise too, Dan. I mean, I consider myself a portrait photographer, you know, and to do color landscape photography was like, what am I doing? You know, but suddenly I was just drawn to this landscape. And I think part of it was I was driving in this landscape with my kids. I was always driving them to karate or whatever and looking at the trees and, you know, taking pictures before I really started working on this. So I think the seed was planted.
I think the subtitle's in that line somewhere, karate and landscape photography. That's your subtitle.
Yeah.
Well, for me, I think it's, and for the people I think about who are watching the Crit House, it's an interesting story for me because you've gone through so many different phases in the world of photography, from being portrait to, you know, to being an editor, and now you're did the documentary of your kids. Now you're doing this, and you don't have to be doing the same thing all the time. You can try different things and do it successfully, because clearly you've done it successfully. And I know that you had one of these images up at the Griffin Museum recently. You won the grand prize there for the.
Well, I won the second prize. Yeah, that was nice.
Was it second?
Sweet. Yeah, I got the. Somebody else got more money.
Oh. you were honored favorably for it.
Yes, I was. Yeah, it was the winter picture. Is it? Anyway, yeah, that was nice. That was sweet.
Well, thank you for showing it. Listen, let me say to all of you, this really, I'm so honored that you have taken your time. And Alex, I know it's very late. Thank you for staying up with us. Thank you for your input. And the same with you, Dan. I know you just traveled internationally very recently and you're jet lagged. Susanne Révy, you have been so helpful, not only for this program, but for me as a photographer and somebody who's learning the photography and the things you have shared with me and about my work and trying to move forward. So thank you. And Erin, I can't thank you enough either. Just having met you not that long ago, but I feel like I've learned so much from you, and all of you to have given your time for this and for the Crit House. I greatly appreciate it. And I will always be in your debt. Thank you. And thank you all for watching the Crit House.